Okay.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Elder Law, Addiction, and COVID-19 webinar. We're very excited to bring everybody together today. We have some hot topics to share. This is with Elder Law expert Robert Slutsky and Sharon Matthew, the Clinical Director of Older Adult Program at Caron Treatment Centers. Elder care attorney Robert Slutsky has practiced elder law for almost 30 years. Rob advises clients on Medicaid and asset protection planning, guardianships, wills, trusts, power of attorney, estate administration, special needs planning, and general estate planning. Sharon Matthew is the clinical director of the Older Adult Program, a program for mature adults at Caron Treatment Centers. Sharon has practiced and worked at Caron for 24 years. She developed and supervised the Women's Extended Care Program for 15 years and has been a part of developing the Older Adult Program, which began in February of 2015. Sharon's focus is also on the family piece and chronic pain addiction. And I would also like to introduce to you Adam Lush. Adam is the Regional Resource Director at Caron Treatment Centers. I will be sharing contact information for all of our guest speakers in a follow-up email, and we'll be able to learn from them today. We're going to begin with Sharon sharing information about the trends in substance use disorder among older adults, and she will be sharing with us how to identify the need for substance use disorder for older adults, the warning signs, the symptoms, and the red flags.
Well, thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for helping to put this together, as well as Adam, and it's great joining all of you this morning. Sorry that our technology is not working, unfortunately, but I can actually now see you on my computer, but you cannot see me because we don't have video on the computer. So it's great to be here this morning. This is a topic that became quite a passion of mine. I will tell you it started by the leadership knowing that older adults were going to be growing, the population that is, and they would need specialized treatment. So 6 years ago in February of 2015, I gathered some folks who were 65 and up on the campus, and I started a group. And from there, we developed a program with the experts of my favorite person is Dr. Wang, who is the addiction doc who works with me, and the expert nurses. And then what we found is that we had to have a dedicated staff, not a designated, but a dedicated staff to treat this population, because it's not everybody's favorite thing to do. So what we knew is that the population was growing. I will get into the ins and outs of treatment and another portion in this presentation. But what we know now is that it is still the fastest growing population in need of substance use treatment. The next several years, there will be more boomers than older adults and older adults in the United States than children. The next 18 years, older adults are turning 65 at a rate of 8,000 to 10,000 a day, and that's a whole lot. What we found is that a third of prescription drugs are given to older adults. So they go to a doctor, they have complaints. Docs might not know that they might have an addiction issue, or maybe they were doing just fine until later on in life, and then other complicating factors entered in. And then also 2/3 of the over-the-counter medications are consumed by older adults. So older adults are living with co-occurring conditions. They might have chronic pain, they might have heart issues, diabetes, depression, anxiety. And as I said, they'll go to a doctor, and what we found is that older adults really do follow what the men in the white coats tell them. So the doctors, they go to with a complaint, the doctors say, here, take this, and usually they take as prescribed until I call it crossing over, until they find that that medication isn't working, and that would be certainly specific for chronic pain patients, that sometimes it sort of catches up with them that the opiates are no longer working. And as you know, or may not know, but as you are on opiates, which was supposed to be a short-term effect to treat chronic pain and illnesses, people were staying on it longer, and then what you have is the hyperalgesia effect, where the meds no longer work and you actually have more pain. So chronic pain is a big issue, the grief and loss that they might go through, loss of purpose, loss of like giving up a job, retirement, loss of a loved one they might have been with for a long time, and just not knowing what to do and too much time on their hands. The other complications, of course, are diabetes, depression, anxiety. And what we found was alcohol was always the first drug of choice. And then opiates were second. And that has sort of lessened now because doctors are no longer allowed to get those script pads out and overprescribe opiates. They are being watched and curtailed. So for us, what we've seen is alcohol still drug of choice first, number one, and then benzodiazepines absolutely second. And we call benzodiazepines freeze-dried alcohol. That is a sedative, it is a pill, it's alcohol in pill form, and people become extremely dependent on that. And those are the two substances, alcohol and benzos, that you cannot stop on your own or you could have a seizure. So it is oftentimes prescribed for anxiety. Older adults will go to a doctor and say, I can't sleep, I'm anxious, or they might have lost a loved one. I've treated a lot of people who had a husband, a wife, or whatever, and then after many years, one person passes away, and then they get dependent on an opiate, a benzo. And then I've treated women, who have been on them 15 years, and getting off of that medication is extremely difficult. And when you try to stop it, you are given a taper, of course, but then too, you still don't sleep, and you don't sleep for sometimes weeks or months. So older adults too, there's 55 million of older adults in the United States, and about 44,000 of those are in need of substance use disorder. I think it is the most, and I think in the next portion, I will be talking about the complications and why don't people recognize that this is an addiction problem. And there are many red flags about that.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Sharon? Sharon, would you like to share the red flags right now and the warning signs?
I surely would. So identifying those are difficult, as I say, because you don't know sometimes, is it the normal aging process? Is this an addiction that's creeping in? And it's interesting with families as well. I'm going to talk about the families a little bit too later on. The denial for them is just as deep as it is for the patients. So doctors might assume it's a normal aging process. They might assume that the cognition is a direct result of maybe the early onset of dementia or other medical complications. But what we watch is that before we get a patient, we'll get reports of families have been worried for quite some time. There's a decrease in their activities of daily living. They have lots of falls. We receive so many patients who have fallen, and then they go to a hospital first. They have bruises that are unexplained. I've treated people that come in with black eyes because they've banged their heads or their face. They have sometimes brain trauma. And I asked Dr. Wang one time, why is all this falling going on? And he said, the equilibrium as you age gets a little, shaky at best, and then you add a chemical to that, and it really affects that part of your brain, so that is why there's so many falls. Absolutely, they seem to isolate. That's when an older adult will maybe, well, are you coming over for dinner today, or are you coming to this event? And they say, no, thanks, I'm not feeling up to it, and then they stay at home. So they're declining social events. As I said, their homes might be disheveled. And with this type of patient, we've actually had family members take pictures of their maybe disheveled homes or apartments, and they absolutely deny it. That was just for that day. It's only that the coffee table, it's a minimization of how their environment really looks. Premature requests for refills if they're going through their medications quicker than the doctor is prescribing, that's an issue. And then, as I said, many life changes, possibly death of a loved one or a friend, or actually we treat a lot of older adults who have lost adult children, and that is a really tough thing to do to get through those horrible feelings, and they absolutely do medicate it. We call it chemical coping, when they are medicating with alcohol or drugs over these extreme emotional issues. There's oftentimes an increase, of course, of alcohol consumption or the benzos, as I talked about. And then what we see is also drinking earlier in the day. They used to maybe drink at dinner time, then it's creeping up to 3 in the afternoon, and then it's going to 11 or 10 o'clock in the morning. Memory issues, sometimes what we get from the families is that we call them and then the next day the person doesn't even remember the conversation. That absolutely is a red flag that something's going on. We see a lot of malnutrition. People are actually drinking their calories. So I see a lot of, especially with women, especially with wine. I see a lot of women who are wine drinkers who who are malnutrition, are not eating food nutritionally, and maybe haven't eaten for days, but consuming all those calories through alcohol. And then sleep complications. As you age, sleeping is an issue as it is. And then if you add those kinds of chemicals, yes, they put you to sleep, but they don't keep you to sleep. So the alcohol and benzos actually wake you up, and then you need more of something. Older adults are absolutely more vulnerable to the effects of drugs and alcohol because their bodies don't metabolize it. It stays in their bodies longer. So it affects every organ of the body. It affects the heart, the liver, the lungs, the muscles, the nervous system, the digestive system, and every cell is affected. And then we also have to really be concerned about the harmful drug interactions. What if they are taking maybe a prescribed benzo and taking that appropriately, but then they're adding alcohol to it? That's like a double whammy. And some drugs don't interact appropriately. So what we find is the older adults sometimes will come in with a laundry list of medications. And by the time they leave here, Dr. Wang is really able to DC a lot of the ones that they really don't need or that are not working appropriately in their bodies, and they can go home with a lot less medication.
Thank you. We do have a comment from Lucy. I had a client recently who would not consider other strategies, talk therapy, exercise, activities, breathing, meditation to manage his depression and anxiety, but want a pill to manage his emotional health.
Absolutely. That is more common than anything that I know of. They do, this population keeps everything close to the vest. I think in the next portion, when I go back on, it's about unique concerns about this population, and that would be one of them. They don't want to just talk, especially in groups. Sometimes they'll talk individually, but it is so, they are so scared to not have that pill, not have, especially a chronic pain person, a person with anxiety, a person with unresolved trauma, a person with unresolved grief. They need something to depend on. And oftentimes we will do, getting someone into this type of treatment, an older adult especially, it takes so much legwork from like what Adam does, the RDs, from the admissions office. We'll do, I was working on a case from March. She's finally here now in September. And she's doing great, but she postponed it. She couldn't do it. Her husband died. I can't even imagine not going a day without some kind of thing to calm me down. There's a lot of relief drinking, a lot of relief using of medications. So that's extremely common.
I'll ask this as a kind of segue into Rob's portion, but Sharon, do you notice that depending on how well a family has prepared for the healthcare needs of their loved ones, if that makes a difference in those patients accessing and entering into treatment?
Say that again, Adam. I must put my brain around that.
So do you notice a difference depending on how the family of the patient has kind of either planned for healthcare concerns or needs or not, and how that impacts someone coming into treatment? Maybe even challenges we may have faced with families that haven't prepared for their loved one? Oh my goodness.
They're not prepared. 90% of the time, they're absolutely not prepared. And what happens is, as I said, the denial in the family is as deep as it is for the patient. They act as if things are going to be better, to be okay, and I don't have to work on this now, and yet they do. And then it's almost like it hits them like a ton of bricks, and then they scramble. And the people we deal with have like maybe 4 ACOAs attached to the case. There's a spouse, there's 4 kids, adult children. There could be siblings who are still involved. Tons of family work is done. And to get them all on the same page, especially for us, and I'll talk about that later about what next, can they really go home? Do they need something else? So having the family on board, but we educate the families even before they get here. Before COVID came, we would have them come and take a tour because they wanted to see, where's my loved one going to be? Are you going to keep them safe? Are you really going to take care of them? So Dr. Wang and I talk breathlessly about what we do, how we do it to alleviate their fears. And usually they do come into treatment, but it's a lot of legwork. And that is exactly why they use a lot of interventionists to help the family find the words. How am I going to stand here, the adult child, and say to dad, who was the patriarch of the family, you need to go away and get some treatment? Or what are we going to do, dad, if something happens to you? They really waylay that. Yes, they do.
Thank you so much for sharing all that helpful information, Sharon. Now we're going to have time to hear from elder care attorney Rob Slutsky. He is going to discuss planning tools and things to consider to protect a family member challenged with addiction.
Okay, well, good morning, all. So I come from a slightly different perspective. First of all, as an elder law disability special needs attorney for a really long time, I've had the honor, benefit, of representing the Montgomery County Office of what used to be called Aging and Adult Services. Now it's called Montgomery County Senior Services. And they, lawyers often take a very different perspective, sort of parental, we know what's best, here's what the rules say. Whereas I've learned more of a social work perspective and direction when attacking some of these cases. So when I understand that there's a couple of things about my perspective that may be a little different. Number one, for those of you who may or may not be in Pennsylvania, that's kind of important. I'm a Pennsylvania licensed attorney, and I will be discussing what I perceive as Pennsylvania law and federal law. So if you're in New Jersey, Delaware, I don't know how many people and where they're coming from are on this presentation. I'm not saying that the law in your state is different. I'm saying it may be different, so you need to understand where I'm coming from. There's a relatively limited amount of time here, so I'm just going to hit a few high points. I'm coming at it really from two different perspectives. One is from the advocate's perspective, where I'm going to talk about tools to advocate for your loved one. And even though we are talking about the older population, and that is my population, you have to understand that I also deal with younger people who have developmental delays and other conditions that don't allow them to advocate for themselves. And therefore, when you're dealing with your older relative who may have a substance abuse problems, it's not very much different in many ways from my perspective of a younger person who has substance abuse problems, because to be honest with you, the single biggest problem that they have typically is a lack of insight into the fact that they have a problem, their ability to control it. So when we talk about the tools I'm using, it's coming from the perspective of you're dealing with people who don't have a really honest view oftentimes, whether it's because of cognitive impairment with dementia or whether it's because simply the condition that they have has clouded their judgment. First and foremost, again, age independent. When we're talking about the drug and alcohol addiction, and we're really talking about impulse control issues. That's the focus of these problems. So when I look at this, certain tools are going to work with people with impulse control issues, certain tools are not going to. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the tools that we would typically see and how they affect or how effective they are in helping for advocacy. So first we have for medical decision making. I'm not talking financial now, just medical. We have the Pennsylvania Healthcare Representative Law, which is called Act 169. Act 169 is for people who don't have a written healthcare power of attorney. And for those people, there's sort of a fallback under Pennsylvania law that lists people starting with the closest blood and marital relationship as potential healthcare decision makers. So typically it starts with a spouse. If the spouse is not the parent of the children of the person we're dealing with, so if you have married and have children from a first marriage and a spouse from the second marriage, the spouse from the second marriage and the children from the first marriage actually have equal decision-making ability / authority. Then we go down to children from the second marriage or after, and then we go to similarly distant blood relationships, and ultimately there is a provision in the statute that allows a close friend to make healthcare decisions. But that kind of assumes that you have a cooperative individual, which is an awful big assumption in an addiction fact situation. Excuse me. One thing that's very clear in every part of Pennsylvania law is that we're always trying to use the least restrictive alternative. So the law allows, even when someone has impaired judgment, their ability to undermine or countermand the decisions made by an advocate. So if you have Act 169 authority and the healthcare facility is speaking to you, that is permissive authority. That means that if the individual themselves suddenly decides they want to countermand or undermine or refuse any of the decisions you've made on their behalf, they have the legal right to do it despite their impaired decision making. So, you know, one of the things that I kind of feel is in many of the situations that we're going to be dealing with people that have impulse problems, impulse control conditions, the Act 169 is probably not going to be a productive, effective, consistent tool, because people will, on a whim, you know, sometimes people with impulse control issues are completely logical and, you know, even thinking at one point, and then become completely illogical and have terrible insight and make terrible decisions another minute later. So unless you have a situation where the person is more likely to be depressed and compliant, Act 169 is probably not going to be a consistent, effective tool if you have someone who is, what's that term, labile, you know, that they're how they think and act is very inconsistent and frequently poor. So the second thing, and I guess it kind of works with a similar way, is the use of a written power of attorney. Now, a written power of attorney at least gives you a little bit more guidance, because the person who has executed the power of attorney hopefully read it, and it evidences what their wishes are as far as certain healthcare decisions and conditions. But again, regardless, if the person has not been declared incapacitated by a judge, then they have the right to withdraw or revoke the power of attorney at any time until a judge says that they lack that ability. So you still have the same risks inherent with a written power of attorney, except with a written power of attorney, you have a statement. Under Pennsylvania law, a written power of attorney assumes that it was executed at a time when the individual understood what they were doing. But importantly, under the guardianship law in Pennsylvania, a written power of attorney sets a priority or a presumption that if the person is ultimately declared incapacitated by a judge, then that is their preference for who their guardian will be. So if a guardianship is later filed and the judge is aware that a certain individual was named as agent under power of attorney, then the judge is going to have the presumption that that is the right person to appoint as guardian. So at least we'll keep the trusted individuals in the family from the point when our principal, the person who has the addiction issues, named someone that they at the time trusted. But again, we still have, you know, at least defined powers, wishes, and expressions of trust at one point. But again, if the person with the addiction impulse control problems chooses to be uncooperative, it's really a challenge. And, you know, there are situations where a person's thinking is so obviously impaired that a facility like Caron might just say, hey, they're so far gone, we really need to just listen to the POA. That might happen. But when push comes to shove, if a person is articulate and can truly express clearly their wishes, even if their wishes are not 100% based in fact and reality, then a facility like Caron is going to have to honor their wishes and not listen to the defined decision maker in that situation, which again is a challenge. Unfortunately, and again, this works, probably you're going to see this more in the older population than in the younger population, because the younger population often is more, and I'm making a judgment based on my personal, I don't know what Caron would say, but is probably in some ways more amenable to treatment because, for instance, you know, we had heard earlier that medication and substances affect the senior body more intensely and stay in the system longer. So you might have maybe more ability to affect treatment for younger people who might be physically healthier and also not have other underlying conditions that might complicate the treatment. So, you know, with a guardianship for, say, a 30-year-old, who then gets into a treatment and it has an effective outcome, you might be able to terminate that guardianship at some point. Whereas when you have an older adult, if you're doing a guardianship, you know, the decision-making issues may be part might be part of the condition with the addiction, but it also could be with an underlying cognitive impairment or with other complicating factors like medications that are necessary for other healthcare issues that can't really be changed. So as a result, the guardianship process may be more required and more permanent in an older adult situation. And for those of you who don't know me or who haven't, dealt with guardianship before, guardianship is a legal proceeding. And it is where basically a judge hears medical testimony and essentially determines that an individual lacks the ability to make safe decisions. And then their decision-making ability is essentially taken away. Now, it doesn't have to be fully taken away. There can still be retained decision-making capacity that a judge can draft into an order. And the type of decisions that are made can be both healthcare, and medical. I mean, healthcare and financial. But, the guardianship is really a legal determination where a judge says, look, this person is not safe to make their own decisions, and appoints someone that they do believe is safe to make their own decisions. A very important thing to understand is that a guardian in Pennsylvania does not have the legal authority to involuntarily commit someone to a psychiatric facility. Now, I admit here, and I probably should have asked Adam beforehand, but is Caron, is it licensed as a psychiatric facility? And if it isn't, okay, if it isn't, then a guardian could probably admit an inpatient to Caron. But one thing people need to understand, and it's often a challenge where the issue isn't impulse control consistent with addiction issues, it's often where we have a mental health situation where the parent is coming to me, we're talking about guardianship, but the reality is a guardian cannot involuntarily commit someone for psychiatric treatment, inpatient. So that's, if you're looking only for the ability to force psychiatric treatment on someone, a guardianship is not really any more effective tool. It's really going to be more for the healthcare side, for medical decision-making, for living arrangements where you can make sure that the person is living in a safe environment, and for managing their finances. So let's talk about how, let's say I'm a loved one, a spouse. Maybe I'm looking to make planning arrangements for my 45-year-old addicted son. And I feel like, well, if I was to provide an inheritance for that son, that would be not a good idea because of the impulse control issues. My son not only is addicted to drugs and alcohol, but my son is also, maybe he's OCD, maybe he's got bipolar disorder, and he goes into manic phases and blows through $100,000 at a time. So in that case, I might want to use a tool to protect him, and just as important, to protect his benefits. The reality is, whether someone is a senior or whether they're young, oftentimes the addictive behaviors prevent them from engaging in consistent gainful employment. And as a result, these are people who often are eligible for means-tested public benefits like Medicaid, called medical assistance in Pennsylvania, or supplemental security income, SSI. So if those people are eligible and I was to leave them or give them significant amounts of money, I would essentially be taking away their eligibility, because to get those programs in general, you have to have less than $2,000 of financial resources, plus any protected resources. You can own a home, you can own a car, but beyond that, you have a very strict limit on the amount of resources. And if I was to give you $100,000, either while I'm alive or after death, that's going to affect your eligibility there. So when I think about this, I often will recommend clients use what's called either a special or supplemental needs trust. So one of the things that we do have to initially state, because we're dealing with today the older population, a special or supplemental needs trust cannot be created and funded after the beneficiary is over the age of 65 or over. So it may not be a tool that we would use in a situation to plan for an addicted older adult. It's usually best for a younger adult, where the funds, a special needs trust is set up under federal law, and that is a tool where, funds can be placed into the account, and the individual can use the resources in that trust for special or supplemental needs. What's an example of that? Travel, special therapies, or medication, or something that Medicaid and Social Security won't pay for. A new bed, furniture, television, extra care. So for instance, let's say that the Medicaid waiver program is paying for 5 hours a day, and they refuse to pay for more than 5 hours a day, but there's a special needs or supplemental needs trust out there for the benefit of that individual. That trust can then pay for additional home care, additional therapies, a lot of different things. It's really a very flexible, nice tool. Probably the single biggest distinction between the two trusts, supplemental versus special. Because of the way special needs trust is set up, it's called a first party trust. So that means that that is the money of the beneficiary. So when we are creating a special needs trust, we are taking money from Ben personally and putting it in the special needs trust for Ben. As a result, there's what's called a payback provision. Because Ben is getting a break there, and he's being allowed to be eligible, even though he had $100,000 from a car accident, for a means-tested program. We're taking that $100,000, putting it into the special needs trust. If there's any money left after Ben dies, which often there is not, but if there is any money left after Ben dies, that money needs to be paid back to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to reimburse their Medicaid program. Whereas a supplemental needs trust is called a third-party trust. That means it's not the money of the individual. So that's where, for instance, a parent says, look, I want to put away $100,000 for Ben. I love Ben, but I don't think he has the ability to control this. However, a parent, after Ben is above the age of 18 in Pennsylvania, has no legal obligation to support Ben. So since that parent doesn't have to give Ben that $100,000, they can put it into the supplemental needs trust, and that has no payback provision. So if Ben dies and there's still $50,000 in the trust, the parent can define in the trust document that it goes to Ben's siblings or Ben's nieces and nephews after he dies. So the supplemental and the special needs trust are great tools. The actual language as far as what the money can be used for is very, very similar between the two trusts. The most important thing is that special needs is the individual's funds, and there is a payback provision, and supplemental needs trusts are a third-party trust, other people's money, and therefore, since there's no obligation to give that person money, there is no payback provision, and the money can be used more flexibly, and after the individual is gone, it can be given to other family members or parties that you'd want to benefit. And again, there is the most important thing for our discussion today, since we are dealing with the senior crowd, is that a supplemental or special needs trust cannot be funded after age 65. So when we have someone who is older and we want to talk about protecting resources, we have to use some other tools. If the person has a spouse, for instance, and it's likely that the individual is going to need long-term nursing care, either in the home or in a facility, we're probably going to be looking at getting Medicaid. If there's a spouse, that leaves us a lot of opportunities to protect resources for the healthy spouse, which is, a good deal of how my time is spent. And what we will do is we will utilize the spousal protection rules in both the federal law and Pennsylvania law to restructure assets so that the spouse that needs care will be able to get the care, but do it in a way that allows them to access Medicaid to pay for that care and leave more resources for the healthy, typically younger spouse to maintain a modest quality of life. Also, one of the interesting pieces of our statutory and regulatory law that works really on both ends is that if a spouse, let's say that you have a parent who is just in need of Medicaid because they are demented or frail, they don't have substance abuse issues, but let's say they have a child with substance abuse issues, they could actually put money into a supplemental needs trust for their child, as long as the child is under 65, and be eligible for Medicaid without any penalties for making uncompensated transfers. That's one of the exemptions in Pennsylvania law, that you can give money to a child who is disabled. Now, that child has to be disabled under federal rules. So typically they'll already be on SSI or SSDI before this starts. But as a practical matter, it's a tool that I use on a regular basis. So if I have a son or daughter who's disabled because of mental health issues or physical issues, sadly, I have a fair number of clients who might have Lou Gehrig's disease, MS, Parkinson's, and as a result, those younger people, I can transfer resources from the cognitively impaired or otherwise frail older adult to the healthy child, to the disabled child, and therefore protect those resources for their future needs while accessing public benefits for the parents. I think for my piece, that's kind of the three big issues that I'd want to address. Let me see if there's any thing that I can answer on that.
We do have a question, Rob. We do have a question from someone. She has worked with 2 different families recently who were taking care of their elderly mothers with impaired cognition and impulse controls. And they weren't interested in getting a guardianship due to the cost and the time that it takes. Do you have any insights to offer to her?
Well, ultimately, one of the things that I have learned over 28 years of practice, Heather, is that I don't push people in a direction they don't want to go. I have found in general that I get a lot of rebound clients, and people will come to me and I'll explain exactly what Lucy explained to her client and give them the exact same advice. And they'll either not say they don't want to spend it, but they choose not to retain me, or they'll say it's too expensive. And then I will hear from them 6 months, 12 months, sometimes 18 months later. Rob, we should have did what you said the first time. It's been a horror story since then. The thing that I would probably say is, Lucy, you've got to tell them, and understand for the rest of you, I know Lucy very well. She is great and she gives wonderful advice to her patients. But Lucy, what you've got to say to them is you've got to look at the big picture and look at the other cost. You can say, okay, you don't want to spend the $4,000 to $8,000, $10,000, whatever it could cost if it's a really if it's a really tough guardianship. You can either spend that now, get control of your life and their life, and get them the care they need, which will ultimately reduce a lot of costs, financial and otherwise. Or you could go through the torture that you continue to go through. You could go through an impaired caregiving plan, because without the guardianship, you really can't put in a safe care plan. And you can end up spending a lot more money on alternative sources of care because you have no control over the situation. Or you could do the smart thing right now, get ahead of the problem, fix it, and then work out a mature, workable care plan that is not only important for the safety of that individual, but for you as a family. Because one of the things that I talk to people about is often they're so afraid of spending this person's money. And I'm like, well, what about your sanity? What about your safety? What about your need to be able to control other pieces of your life and not let that individual's facts and situation basically suck your entire life into that situation and control it? So I look at the different parties who I'm working with and say, it's important that we care for this impaired individual, but it's also important that we keep you sane and alive, because if you die, that person's support system is gone. So that's the way I would probably approach it were it my client.
I'd like to add to that too, Rob. We see a lot of similarities with patients that are seeking treatment for substance use disorder, where a lot of times, looking at what resources they have is really going to determine what treatment options are available. And it can be challenging, particularly in the substance use disorder treatment world, where people are, looking for what they call it, the best deal or the lowest price treatment option, where they probably would not do that if they were, considering other health concerns. So it's something that, really looking at what are you getting for your investment in a treatment program. And that's something, I think that segues, into, Sharon's next section here. But, I'd like to ask that and really ask it to Sharon, but what are some things families should consider when, looking at comparing different treatment options, particularly for older adults? Because, from what I do as a regional resource director in the greater Philadelphia area, I have familiarity with many different resources and programs that are available. I see we had a question about financial concerns that were expressed about co-payments for counseling, outpatient versus inpatient, concerns about sustainability, keeping sober, et cetera. That was a question for our panel. So the financial aspect of this definitely plays a role in, treatment options, but it's also very important that people understand the value that they're receiving when they are making an investment into treatment. So I'll ask that to you, Sharon. What things should people, particularly older adults, be looking for if they're considering treatment for themselves or a loved one?
Well, you're absolutely right. My goodness, I think I have Zoom on my phone now. It's weird, but I don't know if you see me or not.
Oh, we can. We can see you.
We can see you. Thank you.
Dear God. So it's so labor intensive. They want the best bang for their buck. If we are going to charge X amount of dollars, then how comes you're worth it? So we do a lot of explaining. Admissions does that. They have a whole batch of bullet point things that they share with them. And I, working in this unit now for 6 years, I can warrant why we pay, why we have the cost that we do. And that does come into the next concerns. I want to thank for all the information about the legal aspects. That information would be really helpful to my employees, because we are not social workers, although I do have 2 social workers. We can't do that next step of, you need to gather together and see if it's assisted living and see about the finances. We can't step into that arena, but they oftentimes have no clue of what to do and how to do it. So they need a lot of guidance. So having, elder law as a resource is fabulous. So what I know is there are so many unique concerns about this population. And one of the things that admissions does ask them right up front is, do you have a power of attorney? Do you have a medical power of attorney? And do you have a financial power of attorney? And most say no. And they really need to have yes. So sometimes they work on it before the person gets here, or they work on it while the person is here. Because if sometimes, like, we have someone who's extremely cognitively impaired and they can't make decisions, then we need the information to go to the adult children or the spouse so they can carry the ball from there. So some of the unique concerns, and we had to develop the program around it. We started with this idea of what the program should be, but then, as I said, we needed dedicated people who are geriatric specialists. So Dr. Wang is absolutely that. Barb Hassan is absolutely that. She's our head nurse. This is the only unit on campus who has nursing 24/7. So there you go. It is like being in a mini hospital setting. And, we now take people 55 to 90. So it's no longer 65 on up, because people are more compromised at an early age. And I have a 36-year-old right now who had encephalopathy of the brain as a direct result of alcohol. So again, it's not about the age, it's about how compromised they are cognitively or physically. So that's one high end of the program. A lot of individualized. It can't be cookie cutter. It can't be the same size fits all. My therapists, I have never seen them work so tirelessly on each patient, because each has its own little niche and each has its own sort of twerks and tweaks, and they do that. Not only that, but also the family work. As I said, I have never, and I've been around family work for a very long time. This is so hot and heavy, and it's layers. It's not only a spouse sibling, as I said, that kind of thing, but it's maybe 4 ACOAs who all want to be informed, who all want information. I think the good part, and I'll have a thing on COVID in a minute, but the good part is that families now, we do WebEx here, and they can log on and see their loved one, and we can do a family session that way, because we sort of locked down in March, and there's no visiting, there's no family members coming anymore. So that piece has helped a lot. What I also realized early on, it has to be a slow, steady pace because of how they are medically, psychologically, and clinically, and treating them with dignity and respect. This is not a population that you can confront. When I worked at Women's Extended Care, If I had a younger person, I could just say, what the heck's going on with you? You need to change your behaviors. That's not how we do it here. So you walk towards them. You have to realize that sometimes it's not resistance, it's just that they don't feel well. And like, why aren't you getting up today? And why aren't you joining group? Well, that's because I just can't. So we have a slow, steady pace and the non-confrontational approach. Many patients who come in medically compromised, they come in wheelchairs and walkers, and their mobility is really poor. And then the cognitive issues, they've withdrawn, they have to be withdrawn very carefully, especially from alcohol, benzos, and opiates. We've watched a lot of older adults trying to get off of opiates who basically had to be put on medication-assisted therapy because they couldn't manage it. I had an 85-year-old opiate addict, and he literally, after when he was being withdrawn, Dr. Wang tried to take him off the taper completely, and he became delusional. We had to send him to the local hospital. We got him stabilized again, and he went home on medication-assisted therapy. Sometimes an older adult cannot tolerate being off of everything, especially opiates and that type of thing. There's a very complicated grief and loss with this population, as I said before. It's not about their loss of a loved one, it's the profession, it's their purpose in life, or their mobility. Those who have true chronic pain conditions, I have a guy right now who has had at least 15 surgeries and on disability for 20 years, and he's only 68 years old. So what does he do? You know, and he's had other losses as well. So we try to get them up and moving. We believe that movement is the best thing that can happen for them. We have wellness every morning. The wellness team from the rec department comes over. They do either chair yoga or lifting weights, and they do mindfulness and meditation. We have a dance and movement therapist who comes over once a month, and that is an awesome group to watch. If you ever wanted to watch a therapeutic approach that works, especially with older adults, it is a type of thing that we've been now going out into nursing homes and doing it with them, just like we used to have therapeutic drumming, but now he's not allowed to come because of COVID. So we're waiting for that to open up again. So we must be more creative. I've found with this population, and my team has really stepped up to the plate, they love experiential therapy, they love role plays. You ease them into it, and then they're, like you said about storytelling, you get them to tell the story through visuals. I do a lot of sculpting, like of a daily program and a coping skills group. What could we use, you know, in order for them to see that chemical coping isn't working anymore, and what's going to be between you and the next drink or the next drug. Going back to family of origin, what I know is they have stuffed things for years and years and years, never thinking it was a problem, but it's been a problem. Either coming from dysfunction or a family that was, in their time, maybe raised with the dad working all the time, mom being extremely the caretaker, and then I have a woman now who had lots of siblings, and she had to become the young adult at a very young age and help take care of her siblings. Also trauma, people have postponed their trauma. We actually treated an 80-year-old twice. She came in the first time and we thought she was good to go. Well, she never wanted to touch the trauma. She was raised in the war, in World War II in Europe, bombs going off and all that, and poo-pooed it and didn't think it was an issue. It was an issue. She probably had mild PTSD symptoms. The second time she came back, when she couldn't stay sober, she then did the trauma work. So we do have them go in and out of trauma programming as needed. And as I said before, they're very private and keep things inside. So oftentimes heavy-duty things will come out in individual sessions, but then the other parts we do sort of group process. I talked about the denial being so deep, and then you have the issues with the memory loss. We recently treated a couple who, it was the saddest thing I've ever seen. We do treat couples, which is one of the few things, not many people do that. I have one room that's a double, and they can room in the same room, married for many years. Some are married 50 years. So this one was married 20 years, and both alcoholics and both impaired memory. The wife probably is on the verge of dementia, if not there already. So that's the hard piece to decipher as well. We have an excellent psychologist who is trained in geriatric testing, and what we find is we test them early on. It's called the MoCA, Montreal Cognitive Screen. 30 is normal, under 26 you're starting to be impaired, and it's a number that we can go back to them and say, hey, we believe your drinking is impairing your functioning. And then we retest them in a couple weeks, and almost always the numbers go up. And sometimes they do not, which makes us think that maybe this is where it's going to stay and stay stuck. So I don't know, I think my phone.
We still hear you, but we lost video. But
Yeah, we lost
still
video.
coming through loud and
Oh,
clear.
there you go.
There you are.
There it comes. So the creativity I talked about, the family is what gets them here. So it's either the family says, I can't do this anymore, and then they'll hire an interventionist, or they'll make the calls here. They give them ultimatums. You can, and a big one with our population is you will not see the grandchildren. I've had a lot of older adults be the person caretaking while someone was, you know, the parents are working, and they put them on the school bus before COVID. And they then are told you won't see them. And they really stick to that boundary because the adult children are really sick of it and worried, and they won't allow them to drive them anywhere. That really hits home. That is a lot of leverage for them. As I said, the families have tolerated addiction way too long, and the interventionists have a really great, now they come in, of course, on an intervention, and they're extremely angry. They are angry at their families. How could they? Why didn't they give me a chance? Why didn't they just say, why don't you try to stop drinking? Well, you know, they've said that 500 times, and they never heard it. So that's why they use an interventionist. So they're usually angry at the interventionist as well. That dissipates in time. We have specialty groups. Chronic pain they're into if they have that condition. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an excellent approach. They do respond really well to DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy approaches. And we do CPT, cognitive processing for trauma for those who have true PTSD, and that's done on an individual basis. But then the biggest deal is then what? Then what after they go home? What now? Can they go home, number one? Are they mobile enough to go to a 2-floor home? Will they need help in the home? Is somebody going to be there if they do live alone? So the home care is one of the things we utilize. Outpatient, they do now with COVID, which I'll get into. They're doing Zoom meetings, of course, Zoom sessions. Some do actually go to sober living, and my passion right now is where can we have a decent sober living for an older adult, because they can absolutely do it, and they thrive on the socialization. So that's what works here. They get reconnected to people who understand. So the way this works is the commonalities. The fact that they all have so many things in common. They are treated with respect to one another. They're not with, and I don't mean this weirdly, but some have gone to treatment with 19-year-old heroin addicts. That just doesn't seem to work with this population. They don't care what people are using, but it's the age and the life experience that they've had. So also the thing that works really, really well is recovery coaches. Recovery coaches really hold their hand, so to speak, when they first go home. It could be the first couple of days, it could be a week, it could be longer, it could be during the day, it could be all day at first. And that seems to be one of our favorite things because we now have to do a lot of surround services. Our goal and purpose, and I have a bell that they ring at when they leave here, and on it is engraved purpose and quality of life, and that is exactly what we're here to give them, and they absolutely can have it. The reason I love working on this population, not only am I an older adult, but I love watching them come back to health. You can literally see this patient come back to health.
Thank you, Sharon. We've had a lot of questions in the comments. One of the questions is, what is the typical length of stay for an older adult in your treatment center?
Minimum of 6 weeks. And you hear me say minimum. They need every minute of it. And sometimes it's 2 months. The first year we opened, we had a woman here for 5 months, and she's still sober today, 6 years later. So it takes what it takes. And that's hard for them. That's very difficult. I tell them all the time, it takes a lot of courage for an older adult to come into treatment. Picture yourself as an older adult. I'm trying to picture myself. If I had to go to treatment at this stage in the game, my Lord, people telling me what to do and, you know, when to go to bed and when to go to breakfast, my Lord, I don't know. But I give them so much props for that because it's not an easy thing.
Absolutely.
That's a really important point too, that when considering planning for healthcare expenses, you know, typically programs like Medicare are going to not cover a length of stay of that duration or nearly, you know, the length of stay that someone really needs to get better from an issue related to substance use.
Yep. Now, we luckily do now have more insurance contracts, and I do have that double room. So if I have someone with Independence Blue Cross They used to pay 28 days. Now, if we go back to some of these insurance and say, but they're not ready to go, they will, it'll be the same rate, but we are allowed. Before, we couldn't even keep them for 5 weeks. Now we are allowed to keep them for 5 weeks if they need that bit of more time. That's good news. That's perfect news. That's what needs to happen across the board.
Definitely. And someone asked, what about after people leave your treatment center? What happens in terms of compliance with outpatient programs? How effective do you think they are for people that are finished your treatment center and now they want to do the outpatient treatment or program?
So over time, we have learned that, and I'm talking now prior to COVID, over time we have found that older adults do follow directions and there was a higher recovery rate for them. But we do a lot of surround services. As I said, we also have My First Year where we stay connected to them if they would like, and there is a cost to that for a whole year, and we include a family member on that. That works beautifully. Staying connected, keeping track of them. We do when they're first out of here, we do one compliance call. Did they make their first appointment? If they get in that door, it's pretty much a given that they'll continue and finish it, whether it be 6 weeks, 8 weeks. But some don't do IOP. That's sometimes too many days. They certainly don't go to IOP at night because some don't drive, in the evening especially. So then it's private therapy, psychologists, making sure they have a PCP, and keeping that connection. And then, if they struggle, they absolutely are allowed to call back here. My team and I will answer. They absolutely talk to Dr. Wang a lot after they leave here. But what about this doctor? This is what's come up for me. So we don't, we don't go far away from them. But
oh, great. So there's a lot of follow-up contact.
I'd like to also add a newer resource out of our Caron, Philadelphia office located in Plymouth Meeting. So a lot of people on this call that might be close enough to them. But we're starting an older adult intensive outpatient program there. It's starting remote due to COVID, but eventually, once safety can be handled, we'll be doing those in person as well.
And that's perfect. I'm thrilled about that. They had consulted with me what it sort of entails. So I don't care where people get treatment. You have to have the same mindset, same sort of format for an older adult. What we have just started, and the alumni department did this, so Keith in the Philadelphia area, well, he's running all of it. So we don't care where a person goes back to. We now have a once-a-month WebEx alumni meeting for older adults. So they plug in on a Thursday afternoon, 2:30 to 3:30, and they love seeing people that they went through treatment with.
Mm-hmm.
We put one of my staff or myself on there once a month, and they love staying connected, and they are so proud of themselves, and they talk about their recovery. I have a guy there, it's on there now 3 years. We just started this, but he's 3 years sober. We have somebody who's just a month sober, someone who's a year sober. It's just awesome to see. And I know Maria Hendrickson wants to do this in New York as well, as far as an older adult group.
Wonderful resource for people on an ongoing basis. And somebody also wanted to ask, what does treatment look like for the younger patients versus the older adult population? Can you just add a little bit of insight about that for us?
So the younger adults are in what we call the core program. That's the basics of coming in, getting sober, getting educated about 12 steps, and therapy. That piece doesn't change. Ours is more hands-on, more hot and heavy, consistent, walking alongside them. So it's sort of they're good to go and can ramble around and go to lectures and that type of thing. So our lectures and groups are all geared to older adult. It is a lot different. Everybody, though, gets 12-step meetings. That doesn't change in the evening. But then we also offer them other alternatives if they don't like that. Some like Smart Recovery. Some do Refuge Recovery. So with ours, we are one of the signature programs. It's more of concierge service. They get more hands-on, especially with this population, spirituality. So they have my spiritual counselor seeing them individually. They get spiritual lectures once a month. She does grief and loss twice a month because that is such a hot topic. So there's a lot of differences in that type of programming. And it's just more, to me, it's more of everything. And this is more medical. Any other unit does not have the medical component that we do.
Great, thank you. And keep the questions coming. They're really providing a lot more insight for our webinar today. We have a question here. somebody works in an acute care setting and they see many adults who struggle to identify with substance use. Do you have any special things that they should look for to help identify addiction as an issue?
Yes, as I said that earlier on, those complications, you can't, what is this, or what came first, the chicken or the egg? So what the doctors do is they do an SBIRT, which is a real quick mini assessment. There's the Minnesota or Michigan, there's a little quick test that you can ask them a few different questions that gives you sort of an alert, oh my goodness, this might be, I call it, as I said, crossing over, where some people might have drank or whatever for a while and it was okay, and then they went off the rails when you had a significant life event. Then I have those here who have been drinking all their lives, and it finally, because as I said, as you age, you can't metabolize. So then you're seeing the complications of alcohol use. And again, going to a savvy doctor, all of our docs are addiction medicine doctors, and they do know the right questions to ask, and they do know what to look for in the lab work. You can do tests, you can do the hair test, you can do the PET test, you can do a blood test. Then you will get the specifics, because I've had a lot of people, as I said, in denial, and I'm talking about 58-year-olds, 62-year-olds, where Dr. Wang will order those tests, and their PET test comes back phenomenally high, and they still deny that they used a lot. So that's sort of the point you have to look at. And again, as I mentioned, the falls, the unexplained bruises, are they using too many medications? But consulting with people who are experts is your best recourse.
Yeah. And, just to add, there's a couple resources that we have. If, your staff is interested in learning more about SBIRT or how to implement that, we have an educational department that has resources to teach that to your team. You can call me and I can help set that up. Also, at our Plymouth meeting, our office in Plymouth meeting, we can do in-person assessments. So, if that's something, to get a full assessment to determine, from a professional, that's expert in this, having them kind of go through the whole patient history, what their issues are, and make an assessment that way is usually the best approach. But a lot of times, if you sense there might be a problem, I'm going to lean on the side it's worth looking into it, because people get really good at hiding their challenges with substance use disorder. And, maybe Sharon, that's something you can speak to a little bit, like particularly with older adults, how this might, kind of go under the radar until it's very late stage. And that, if you catch the early warning signs, it's like a little bit easier to work with potentially.
Absolutely.
So maybe
once they're entrenched in that denial, it's pretty tough to break through. So I tell families all the time, they have to sort of lower their expectations. You may never get them to admit that they passed out, last month or whatever. You definitely do. But if only people would identify the warning signs. But that's where, again, the family is in their own denial. I wanted to speak a little bit about someone saying about, do we take, we are behavioral health, so co-occurring, yes, we treat anxiety, depression, and all that. But if someone has their initial diagnosis is mental health, we are not able to treat them. It has to be alongside of one another. But we do assessments, and that's why we had initially, now we don't prefer a rapid assessment for older adults, but sometimes we have to, where someone will come in for 14 days. I just had this woman here, and the family didn't know she was hiding, sneaking, getting more meds than they thought, and we finally discovered it. And here she was medicating a whole ton of trauma, and we got her through it. She then stayed 4 weeks instead of 2, but it took what it took. So assessments, and we can do that, and then we, through collateral information, all the tests I talked about, can really come back to you and say, but we have a guy right now, he's been here, but he does need to move on because he is primary psych, and that's not what we treat.
Well, back to talking about COVID-19, someone had asked, have you seen an increase with requests for treatment since the pandemic, with everybody having more social isolation and more fear and maybe depression setting in a little bit more?
That's exactly right. So initially it was not, they weren't rushing in here, but then we got to the point where we were absolutely had a waiting list again. So it ebbs and flows. And we're usually now full. Right now I had a little lull again. And COVID absolutely played a role because people were afraid to go out. But what was happening is that does not stop them from drinking. They were taking a cab to the liquor store. They were ordering, or, you know, you had to put your order in and then pick it up. It turns out it has fueled, to me, addiction. As I said, they're drinking earlier in the day. Some people who had treatment before were doing Zoom meetings. They really don't like them. So then they use that as an excuse. I really didn't feel like I was connected, blah, blah, blah. So the relapse rates went up. Now, the beauty of that is they are coming back to us. So they obviously liked, I have a woman right now, came back to us for a refresher, and she was sober 16 months. And as a result of some stuff with the husband that was never resolved, and Zoom and not staying connected, she drank. She said it was 4 drinks, but it turns out there was, how much did we figure? There was 8 ounces in each of those 4 drinks, so it was 32 ounces. So she relapsed, yes. She called it slip. I said, there are no slips. So it's more prevalent, the relapse rate. Since COVID, the family members appear to be more, so this is what happened. The family members are home. They're seeing more of the problem. So that's what prompted people to say, oh my God, we better get some help for them. So that played a huge role. It's been more difficult, however. The difficulty is getting them to the next level of care. Assisted living nursing homes weren't taking anybody for a while, or you had to quarantine 2 weeks at home, which didn't mean here, it meant at home prior to coming there. They're not sometimes accepting therapists. We're doing Zoom, but what we found with that is some therapists were full, some therapists were going to retire and not taking any more people. So it's been difficult that way to find ongoing therapy. And then sober livings had limited space. They were full as well. There's some waiting lists at some of them. And then finding, as I said, the perfect one or the good ones or the appropriate ones for older adults is difficult. So COVID has played a huge role, and that is why one thing that has worked for us is sober coaching.
Well, thank you so much. You've added so much, so many enlightening thoughts to how we can be a better resource to people that are really struggling with addiction. And we really appreciate that. And thank you, Rob, for sharing with us how we can help people that are challenged with addiction be more prepared with their legal.
So how could we get that information from Rob? So that would be extremely helpful.
So we have these wonderful guidebooks, which I'm happy to share with the Caron Treatment Center. And anybody else on the call, we will be doing a follow-up email. And if you would like to request any of these guidebooks, I'm happy to give you some to share with families that you work with. They have information about our office in there, our services that we provide, and there's a plethora of legal articles that will help with several different topics: guardianship, power of attorney, a little bit of information about Medicaid, Medicare, and then they also have all the skilled nursing rehabs, assisted living.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's a really wonderful, lovely little resource. And we do have websites as well that provide that information. So we're happy to share all that information in our follow-up.
We obviously, well, you don't know, I mean, maybe you do. We're literally almost walking distance from your office in Plymouth Meeting.
Oh, that's great.
So if you ever want, we could just drop off those books at the front door with masks, socially distanced.
Adam, could you get those for us?
Absolutely.
Sure.
We have them for the 3 counties, Montgomery, Chester, and Delaware.
But we do service Philadelphia and Bucks as well.
Somebody mentioned caregivers. They are absolutely worn out. They oftentimes have more nerve problems taking other people's medications. You know the phrase, take your oxygen first. They don't get that they have to take care of themselves before they try to take care of other people. So they go down the tubes pretty quickly. They're exhausted. They get a little sarcastic, and it's a downward spiral and that kind of thing. So I can't stress enough how caregivers absolutely need to practice self-care. And the answer is, and sometimes when you talked about the people being concerned about the estate or the finances, what we find is there's a discrepancy sometimes in the siblings. Like if there's 4 adult children, Like one might be okay with assisted living or nursing home, the other one say absolutely not because it's going to, of course, take from there. It's tough to say, but it's true. Sometimes they don't agree on the next level of care because of the finances.
Well, and again, and that's when the conversation comes into about the value of what they're spending their money on, whether it be law services or addictive treatment.
Yeah,
definitely.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. If we have any more questions, you can put them in the chat for a couple more minutes. And then also we will be following up, as I mentioned. Please reach out if you have any questions for Adam, Sharon, or Elder Care Attorney Rob Slutsky. We're all happy to be a resource to you. At Slutsky Elder Law, we are doing phone consultations and video consultations through Zoom. So we're happy to meet with somebody, and we are able to get documentation notarized via the Zoom right now. So thanks so much for joining us today for the webinar.
Thank you.
Do you have anything else to add? Anybody else?
I just wanted to share that we did record this webinar, so we will have this available via a link on Caron Treatment Center's YouTube channel. So we will send that out to everyone that attended. We also have recordings of our past webinars on that channel, which you might find interesting. I know there's one with Sharon and Dr. Wang talking a little bit more detail about the older adult program. And then there's just quite a few webinars on a variety of different topics. At Caron Treatment Centers, we treat everyone from teenagers and adolescents all the way up to older adults. We have specialized programs for all those individuals. So there's plenty of info there, and you can always reach out to me if you ever have specific questions about anything offered at Caron.
Thank you, Adam, for helping with this.
Certainly.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time out to join our webinar.
All righty. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day. Thank you so much.